And now it is my pleasure to introduce our opening keynote. We are honored to have Professor Caroline Hoxby here to present her latest research on charter school achievement. Professor Hoxby is the leading scholar in the economics of education. She is best known for promoting scientific methods and research on education policy. She holds a PhD from MIT, studied at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and obtained her BA at Harvard University. Professor Hoxby is currently the Scott and Danya Baumer Professor of Economics at Stanford University, and prior to arriving at Stanford, she was the Freed Professor of Economics at Harvard University for 13 years. She is currently studying how education affects economic growth, globalization in higher education, peer effects in education, and the effects of charter schools on student achievement. Please help me welcome Professor Caroline Hoxby to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. I'm really delighted to speak to you. It's always an honor for me to speak to charter leaders and people who work in charter schools. Today, what I'm going to be talking to you about is the results of some of the studies I've done of charter schools in the United States, specifically my studies of New York City's charter schools and Chicago's charter schools. And what makes these studies unique is two things. The first is that they are lottery-based studies. In other words, we're going to make use of the lottery so that we have a really good comparison group for the students who attend charter schools. Now, as a matter of fact, every lottery-based study that has been conducted in the United States has found positive effects, sometimes very positive effects, of charter schools. And that's in contrast to studies that do not use such scientific methods. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about why it's so important to do lottery-based studies and to use the most scientific methods. I think it's important not just because it's a nice scientific method, but because it's really your best chance as a charter school of getting a very fair evaluation of what it is that you do. The second thing that makes these studies unique is that they are the only lottery-based studies of really large numbers of charter schools. In New York City, as you may know, there are more than 100 charter schools just in the city itself, and in Chicago, there are about 70. So these are big studies. They cover a lot of charter schools, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I wish I had a study of California charter schools. I'm sorry I don't right now, but that's something we could talk about afterwards in the breakout session when I'd be glad to answer your questions about charter school evaluation. Okay. So lottery-based evaluation is considered by almost all researchers to be the gold standard in terms of how to evaluate charter schools. Well, why is this? It's essentially because most charter schools in the United States operate lotteries because they're oversubscribed. And what we do in a lottery-based study is we follow the students who win the lottery, we call them the lotteried in, and the students who lose the lottery and continue to attend the regular public schools. We call them the lotteried out. It's a little less judgmental than winners and losers, right? Okay. So why is it crucial to follow these lotteried in and lotteried out students? Well, the lotteries generate the ideal control group for the students who actually attend your charter schools. And the lotteried in and the lotteried out students are alike because it's just coin flipping, right? The lotteried in and the lotteried out students are just alike on everything we can see about them, race, ethnicity, whether they're English language learners, whether they're participants in special education. So that's great. But what's far more important is that they're alike on everything that we can't observe about them, but we suspect is important for how well they do in school. Lotteried out students, their parents went through the same application process. They went and looked at the charter schools. Everything was the same, apart from the fact that their name was not pulled out of a hat in the lottery. So they are the same on motivation. They're the same on parental involvement. Maybe they were having the same problems in the regular public schools before they applied to your charter school. The point is that in a lottery-based study, no one can ever say that the results of your charter school are caused by cream skimming or any other type of selection of students. Okay? That is really critical. Okay? It's that we've got this ideal control group, and no one can claim that the results are the effect of cream skimming or anything else like that. Okay? A pure apples-to-apples comparison. What else is great about lottery-based studies? Well, if I were a charter school leader, I would want a lottery-based study for the simple reason that it really does not allow the researcher to control the outcome of the study. If your charter school is doing well, you're going to look good in a lottery-based study because the researcher doesn't have very many choices. I mean, I gather data from the lottery. I track these two groups of students. I just follow them forward over time. And as long as I'm pretty competent and I can compute a few statistics in Excel, I can actually ensure that I get the right answer. So we tend to get the same answer all the time in these lottery-based studies, at least so far, which is that the charter schools are doing better on average. You know that that's not what all studies find, and that's essentially because they are less reliable in their methods. In lottery-based studies, you don't have to depend on the researcher being on your side. Okay? The other two methods that are common, the first one is called a matching-based method, and the second one is called a pure value-added method. The matching-based method is perhaps a little familiar to you. You have your charter school students. The researcher comes in and tries to find some comparison students for your charter school students. Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of latitude in which students they choose as the comparison students, and that means that your evaluation, your charter school, is really subject to a lot of unreliability. It's a serious problem. So let me give you a concrete example. You have a student in your charter school. He's in the 3rd grade. Maybe he's black, and he's free and reduced lunch. Well, I have to find a student to compare to him who's black in the 3rd grade and on free and reduced lunch. But guess what? There are a lot of black 3rd graders on free and reduced lunch in your school district and in the state of California. That gives me way too much latitude as a researcher so that you can see how a researcher is going to be able to influence the outcome of this study. And that's why so many charter school studies that are politically motivated in particular are not very reliable. There's another type of study that you may have heard of called a pure value-added study. That's where we compare how well a charter school student does while he's in the charter schools to how well he was doing before he entered the charter school. Those types of studies have been shown consistently to be very biased against charter schools, so you really don't want to do those. The match-based studies are better than those. They're just unreliable. They're not biased against you. Okay, so the lottery-based studies that we're currently conducting, I told you that they're in New York City and Chicago, and that we study virtually all the schools in those cities. And over 95% of the applicants in those cities are in lottery, so we're studying virtually all of the students in those cities. We're focusing right now, what I'm going to tell you about today is their scores on statewide exams and whether they graduate from high school, but you can study any outcome in a lottery-based study. Whether you go to college, disciplinary outcomes, just about anything you can track, you can study in this type of a study. There's no reason why we just look at test scores or high school graduation. We're going to look at a per year effect. In other words, we're assuming that a student who spends 4 years in a charter school is going to experience more of an effect than a student who only spends 1 year. And in fact, that's what the data do show. Okay? Now, the lotteries are random. I want to just assure you that it isn't just, I said it was coin flipping. It really is. These are data from New York City. The Chicago data look quite similar. You can see that the lotteried out students who are the green bars and the lotteried in students who are the red bars are equally likely to be poor, to be black, Hispanic, English language learners, involved in special education. They also have prior test scores, in other words, prior to applying to the charter schools, that are just the same in reading and math. Okay, so the lotteries really are random, and that means that we have a very good comparison group for our charter school students. So what is the effect that we estimate as we follow these students going forward? Well, in New York City, what we find, and I'm going to interpret these numbers for you in a minute, so don't worry, is that math scores go up by about 1/10 of a standard score point each year you spend in charter school, and reading scores go up by about 2/3 of a standard score point for each year you spend in charter school. In New York State, students take the Regents examinations in high school grades, and for each year they spend in a charter school, their Regents scores go up by 3 to 4 points, depending on the exam. Also, for each year a student spends in charter school, in charter high school in New York City, their probability of graduating goes up by about 7%. Okay, now these may not seem like dramatic numbers, but let me try and interpret them for you. Each year, there's a pretty moderate effect, but they add up over time, because remember, all of those were per year effects. So let's just take that 7% more likely to graduate from high school for each year you spend in charter high school. Well, that means if you spend 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade in a charter high school 4 years times 7% a year, you're 28% more likely to graduate from high school in New York City if you attended a charter high school than if you attended a regular public school. Everything else being equal, okay, compared to the lotteried out students who were just the same. 28% more likely. That's a very big difference in the probability of high school graduation. Or how do those test scores play out? How does that close the achievement gap? Well, it turns out it closes the achievement gap a lot. So this next chart that I'm showing you shows you on the bottom, you can see there are grades there, grade 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Grade 3 is the first grade that's tested in New York State. Okay? And right along the bottom, those are the scores of the lotteried out students. The lotteried out students essentially have pretty flat achievement in New York State. That doesn't mean they don't learn anything. It just means they learn about enough each year to stay at about the same percentile in the test score distribution. But the lotteried in students are shown by the green line and the red line. The red line is just a smoothed version of the green line, which is the raw data. Okay? And you can see that with every passing year, the lotteried in students are doing better relative to the lotteried out students. At third grade, they're only a little bit better. By fourth grade, a little bit more. By eighth grade, they're scoring 30 points more on the New York State math exam than the lotteried out students who started at exactly the same place and who were exactly the same in the beginning. Well, what's 30 points? Is 30 points a lot or is 30 points a little? It's not obvious. You're not New Yorkers, right? So it doesn't mean very much to you, perhaps. But I chose to make the scale of this graph the difference between Harlem, which is the lowest performing area of New York City, and Scarsdale, which is the highest performing, one of the most affluent suburbs of the whole New York metropolitan area. Okay? Scarsdale, very high performing, affluent kids, mostly white, nobody's disadvantaged, really well reputed public schools. Harlem, the lowest performing area of the New York City public schools. 35-point difference. Now that's a big achievement gap. I'm not just comparing black and white within New York City, I'm comparing the very best of the New York metropolitan area to the worst in terms of student achievement. They're separated by 35 points. If you remain in the New York City charter schools all the way through grade 8, you have closed 30 of those 35 points. More than 85% of the achievement gap is closed by the New York City charter schools in mathematics. I think that's really an incredible amount to just close by 8th grade. In reading, it's a bit less. It's about 2/3 of the achievement gap is closed by 8th grade. But still, these are dramatic effects, right? Most of the kids in the New York City charter schools are coming from places like Harlem. That's why I picked out Harlem. And the fact that they're able to rise to the level almost of the Scarsdale kids over grades K through 8 is a really impressive change in their outcomes. Chicago charter schools actually have bigger effects than New York City charter schools have on average. They raise standard scores by about 15% of a standard score each year in math and in reading. And to put that in perspective, that is each year, that is 4 times the amount of reducing class size by 10%, say a class size change of 3 students, maybe 3 or 4 students, something like that. Okay? Furthermore, if you reduce class size by 3 students, you only get that effect once. If you reduce it every year between grades K and 8, you don't get any extra effects. Charter schools, they're having a dramatic effect each year, much more so than many other interventions, and the effects accumulate, which is really what makes them close the achievement gap over time. Well, we've seen that the typical charter school in New York City and Chicago is having a pretty big positive effect on student achievement. Why is that? Well, you know, your judgment really here is as good as mine. It's something that the typical charter school has in common with other charter schools. We all know what those things are. Relatively strong incentives to perform, families who don't have to stay if they're not happy with your school, autonomous management, the ability to hire the teachers you want, to have the teachers leave who you want to have leave, governance that's more like that of nonprofits than the sort of political governance of a typical school district. Routine diagnostic assessment of students, that's very common in New York City and Chicago charter schools. Student uniforms and strict dress codes, again, very common in those 2 cities' charter schools. And of course, the lack of union work rules. There are hardly any unionized schools in either of these 2 cities. Of course, not all charter schools have the same effects. We all know that that's true. And we all know that charter schools that don't have the most positive effects would like to improve. So a good question is, can we learn anything by looking at the range of effects that we see for the charter schools, especially the charter schools in New York City where there are more than 100. So there's really quite a range of different effects. All right, what I'm showing you here in this graph, I know it's a little confusing to see, is 2 different distributions. The first one is the range of achievement effects for the regular public schools. And you can see it looks a bit like a bell curve. Okay? The regular public schools, some of them have a good effect on student achievement, some of them do not. Okay? The charter schools distribution is this one on the right in dark green. And you can see, first of all, it's shifted to the right of that of the regular public schools. That means that on average, the charter schools are having a positive effect on achievement. And you'll see that it shifts the whole distribution of student achievement upwards. Okay? The whole distribution is shifting up. Now, that's not to say that all charter schools are having the same effect. If they were, that wouldn't be a distribution. But you can see that that distribution is quite tight. It's tighter than the distribution for the regular public schools, which implies that the charter schools are having, fewer of them are having negative effects. And on average, they're having a positive effect. So I think this is a really important graph to see, just to realize the whole distribution is being shifted up by charter schools in New York City. Now, as I said, some of these charter schools are more successful than others. We can try and learn something from the charter schools that are more successful by looking at the policies that they have vis-a-vis the policies that charter schools have that are not doing quite as well in terms of their effects on student achievement. But we can't learn a lot. I want to be perfectly honest with you here. I'm going to be able to show you some policies that are associated with schools that do really well in New York City. But I cannot promise you that if you were to implement those policies, they would cause your charter school to do better. That's the difference between causation and correlation. And until someone allows me to experiment with their charter schools in New York City and assign them to certain policies, not very likely, I'm not going to know whether these things cause charter schools to be more successful or whether they're just associated with greater success. So I'm just being absolutely upfront. I didn't get to do an experiment. I didn't get to assign anyone to having, this set of teachers or that set of teachers. Nobody lets me do that sort of stuff. We researchers, we live banal sort of lives. Okay, so charter schools policies are quite different. The left-hand column here shows you charter schools policies in New York City. The right-hand column shows you the average for the regular public schools in the same city. In Chicago, there's a little less variation, so that's why I'm focusing on New York City here. The first thing to notice is that the charter schools have 2.5 more weeks of school on average each year than the regular public schools have, but there's actually a range among the charter schools. Some have a typical 180 days. Some of them have 220 days in New York City, so big range. On average, they have about 2.5 more hours of school each day. Again, there is some range between about 6 hours and something more like 9. About half of them have Saturday school. They tend to have a long number of minutes of reading each day, about 30 minutes more than the regular public schools. About half of them have a long math period, 90 minutes or more. Routine internal assessments, school uniforms very common, as I mentioned before. About half of them have a parent contract, and about a quarter of them have something that we call small rewards, small punishments, discipline, sometimes associated with a point system, sometimes more informal than that. Okay? So what policies tend to show up in the charter schools that are more successful in New York City? What we find is that the schools that have a long school year, long school day, and Saturday school tend to be more successful than those that do not. Not surprisingly, those schools also have a long reading period and a long math period. This is what I call the sort of the long set of policies. Okay? They tend to have this small rewards, small punishments disciplinary system. We probably even underestimate this association because it's hard for us to characterize charter schools' disciplinary policies, but that's associated with the more successful ones. Teacher pay that is based on performance and duties and not just based on seniority and credentials is characteristic of the charter schools that are more successful. And finally, a mission statement that emphasizes academic achievement. That's probably no surprise to anyone, but it suggests that the school is thinking hard about academics. There are a couple of policies that we expected might matter to whether a school was more likely to be successful or not, and they didn't. So let me tell you what they are. The first one was how many years the school has been in operation. We found that once we knew what policies the school had, it didn't really matter that much whether the school had been in operation for 8 years or 1 year. What really mattered was the policies that they had. And also what type of operating agency they have in New York City. We see EMOs, we see charter management operations, we also see community-grown organizations, things that come out of volunteer, all kinds of philanthropic things in the New York City area. It doesn't really matter which of these three is your operating agency, at least in New York City, and the same was true in Chicago. Okay, that doesn't seem to matter, it's the policies. Now, you'll all want to have some, if I were you, I would want to have some bottom line from a researcher like me. Is there anything that you can do right now, today, to ensure that you're evaluated more fairly in the future? Well, the first thing you can do is, of course, once the California longitudinal data system comes online, and that's going to be sooner rather than later because of Race to the Top, you can ensure that you are in a lottery-based study. As I said before, every lottery-based study has been favorable to charter schools so far, and you're not subject to the whims of the researcher. You're going to get a fair assessment if you're in a lottery-based study. So I strongly encourage you, once that longitudinal data system comes online, to participate in that. I think it's a fantastic idea. What about right now? What can you do right now to make your life easier to make sure that you're evaluated fairly? Well, the first thing that you can do is you can make your lottery data right now available to reputable researchers. And they can probably do a lottery-based study for you now just using your data and some data from your school district. So that's something that you can do today. The next thing that you should do, and I really encourage all of you to do this, go back to your charter school, assign somebody to do this. It will take about an hour. Okay? Check that the data that's posted for your charter school, not just at the California Department of Education website, but at the US Department of Education website, is accurate. Most charter schools have inaccurate data posted. And then, the research on your schools is not accurate, and they're often mischaracterized. So take the time to check. You can correct it. Okay? That's something you can do today. Describe your policies clearly on the web, again, to keep you from being mischaracterized by researchers. These are things that's something that can help a lot. And then finally, consider when you get those charter school applications, don't just learn about the students who you're actually going to enroll. Try and learn a bit more about the students who aren't going to enroll at your charter school. Try and really find out what public school they would otherwise be attending. Learn about whether they're free lunch eligible, things like that. Try and get pretty good data on that. And then finally, consider getting a consent from them so that you can find out what their prior test scores were prior to attending your charter school. This will help you dismiss anyone who says you're cream skimming or you're doing this or you're doing that. If you know that piece of information, you're going to be able to answer those questions much better. Well, that's where I'm going to stop today. I'm delighted to be here with you. I hope that you all have the greatest of success in your charter schools and your endeavors, and I hope that you all get evaluated very fairly in the future. As I mentioned earlier, there will be a breakout session at 9:45 where I will be glad to answer questions you might have about evaluations, about an ongoing evaluation that you have underway or something that you have in mind. And with that, let me leave you, and thank you very much for your attention.